Hi everyone, I'm just giving it a minute so everyone can join in and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so hi everyone, welcome. My name is Jessica Taran Salazar and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Creating and Maintaining a Classroom Community During Distance Learning. It will be hosted by Adrienne Now, and this is our first CalTeach system-wide tech webinars for the school year. Before we begin, I would like to ask for all of our folks that are joining us tonight to please put yourselves on mute. If you have questions, please utilize either the hand raising feature or write it in the chat. Myself and our program director who's joining us, Chelsea Arnold, will be helping Adrienne navigate that or keep an eye on that. So our presenter today is Adrienne Now. She's been in the education field for over 20 years, teaching middle school, and then before that, she transitioned to the district STEM coach and eventually ran the Merced City School District STEAM Center. In her current role, Adrienne is the new science coordinator for the Merced County Office of Education, and Adrienne is also a lecturer for our CalTeach program at UC Merced. So we're very excited to have you here, Adrienne, but with that said, I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right. Great. Thank you, Jessica. So welcome, everybody. And I know that we have kind of a broad range of people in the room. And so I know some are CalTeach students, some are mentor students. And so, and there's going to be, normally, depending on how many people are in the room, some of what we have might be a little more interactive, but we do have quite a few signed up for this evening. And so we're definitely going to be using the chat. And so I'm going to, and that's actually why Jessica and Chelsea are going to, thank you, are going to be monitoring the chat. And so it's a great place to ask your questions. Also, there are a lot of experts in the room as well who might be in the classroom. And those of you who are asking questions, you might be able to also begin to form your community that way. So this is, again, we're going to talk about creating and maintaining a classroom environment in an online situation, which is what many of us are finding ourselves in right now. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Allow Zoom to share. Open.
I believe we are having technical difficulties, but she'll be on just in a few.
Sorry. Okay. Awesome. Gotta love technology, right? Just like the first day of everybody's class, right? Nothing works. So let's try that again. If not, actually, I'm going to have then Jessica share. There we go. Zoom decided, since it updated, it was not allowed to share my screen. So this is, these are our slides, and these slides will be available from Jessica. So you don't need to frantically be taking notes. So we're going to kind of, this is what we're going to be discussing this evening. Again, if you have questions, the Zoom features, I do like to review those because I know a lot of people are using different platforms. The Zoom features are located at the bottom of your screen. That's where you're going to find your mute button that Jessica referred to. We do prefer, if you could possibly leave your camera on, it does, that whole nonverbal communication is really helpful, although it's a little difficult because there's only 5 on the screen at a time. But that's also where the hand raising is. It's on your participants button. And the chat also is located on the bottom of the screen. So we're going to discuss creating a community of distance learners. So these are kind of our essential questions. So most of this is probably going to be directed, and it's going to sound very much like a K-12 environment. And yet there's going to be a lot of these management components that I actually use with my college students. So they're across the board, even though you might think, oh, this is an adult thing. It actually, it really can be as well. So we're going to talk about how can we build a community of learners in this online environment, and building these relationships and growing the community in this online environment. How do we support that growth of community? And then again, we're going to discuss different tools to support this community of learners in both asynchronous and synchronous instruction. and how can we support students during this for their social emotional learning in an online classroom? Because really that social emotional learning component is really why a lot of kids come to school. So those are kind of we're going to discuss that as well. So our objectives, we're going to talk about the purpose of creating an online community and discuss like areas of need for behavior expectations, look at some sample expectations and figure out how this may or may not apply in different situations. And then again, identify resources to to support teachers and students. So the first thing I always like to do is to go over the norms. This is the same in any classroom. And so we've kind of familiarized ourselves with the Zoom platform and tools. We're going to have our microphones muted when not speaking, but please, if you can, leave the camera active during discussions. So while I might have already mentioned this, you know, this is in visual form. Again, in an online community, that visual support for your non-auditory processing students is really important. The chat is going to be used for questions, clarifications. It can also be used for discussion that's going to deepen the understanding of the group. So, you know, if somebody asks a question and either I don't see it right away or it's something that you have some thoughts on or some experience with, please feel free to use that chat as part of that discussion. If your internet does become unstable, sometimes turning your camera off is great. The other thing that we're finding with Zoom and all these online is if you unplug the device from the power. So sometimes when these devices are powering up and filling the battery as well as running a really high functioning program like Zoom or Google Meets, we're finding that it also can decrease the internet connection. So sometimes that works too if you have enough battery life. So talking about the room, so if you are a CalTeach student in your chat, if you wouldn't mind, you know, your name, your year in school, and what your motivation is to be a teacher. For those of you who are in the classroom, your name, you know, obviously the year in school, not so much. What motivated you to go into education? Was it to be a distance learning teacher? And then your classroom experience. So we're going to give people a moment to kind of, and I'm going to leave this up here, to use the chat. So one way to build an online community, especially because we had up to 88, 90 people who had registered for this course, when you get into really large numbers, the chat becomes your friend because nobody has to wait, they're not having to talk over each other. And so I do like to use the chat in larger groups. So we're going to look at use the chat today a lot. All right, so we have name. So if you are a student in school still, what is your year in school? And what is your motivation to be a teacher? Or what was your motivation to become a teacher? And what classroom experience do you have? Excellent, yes, sharing our knowledge, yes. Okay, excellent, senior at Davis. I went to Davis. Loved it there, it was animal science. High school math teacher. Ooh, there's a calling for there. So as you're kind of looking through the chat is also a great resource to build community as well, because like I said, I've already like, oh look, there's a couple of Davis grads, like wow, I'm alum, you know, so you can start to kind of build that community and build those relationships and use the chat to find things in common. A lot of depending on the age that you teach, I was in middle school for 16 years, so the chat can be a very daunting place for the grown-up to turn loose for students. And so we're going to talk about some ways so I've given some very, very clear directions. So clarity is really a big deal when you're creating your online environment. Clarity and confidence. And so it's like, hey, I am confident that you guys can use the chat well. So, you know, this is a great place to go. And again, we're going to talk about establishing norms and expectations and routines as well today. So I'm going to let everyone continue to roll through that chat, but we're going to keep moving as we go through this. So the next thing I wanted to highlight, this is just kind of a cute little intro. So why do kids come to school? So this woman asked these very small children, what is your favorite thing about school? And it's sometimes what we would totally expect kids to say, and sometimes it's not. Let's see.
I'm Brittany Webster, and this is the question of the week. I'm here at the Windsor Museum celebrating the PD Day before Halloween, so kids are dressed up in the best costumes, but I actually want to know about school. So kids, this question's for you. I want to know, what's your favorite thing about school?
Banana toys. That we do lots of math, and I love math.
Yeah, what's your favorite part about math?
That we learn about calendars and subtracting and adding. Playing.
Playing, and what's your favorite toys to play with?
The kitchen. I like adding with math, and I like reading stories and writing them.
And Kaylee, what's your favorite thing about school?
Doing homework.
Doing homework? And why do you like doing homework so much?
Because it's fun. Coloring.
And what is so awesome about coloring?
Because we get to make crafts playing outside.
Whether it's math, reading, or the bell at the end of the day, everyone has a favorite part of school. So what's yours? Let us know by finding us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm Brittany Webster here at the Windsor Museum, and this is WeTV's Question of the Week.
So of course, as the educator and the one who's trying to figure out environment and online environment, of course, my start, as every one of those kids answered, and she was like, why is that your favorite? And then they would kind of say, oh, because it's fun, or because, you know, then there's also, you got to kind of think about, like, what is the situation that that student is experiencing during that time? So some of them talked a lot about play, and if you looked at the size of the children that were saying that, that was completely appropriate, because when you get into the, you know, the pre-K, K times, that learning occurs through play, and that's what all the research says. And so really, you know, she does equate play with school, which is fantastic. And, you know, and then you get into some of the other ones where they start talking about math, and I loved how she was like the calendar, because, you know, if you think about calendar, it's got numbers on it, you know, and then she also talked about adding and subtracting, and she was, you know, able to use some vocabulary. And so it was kind of interesting listening to all those different kids and talked about that. The little girl with homework, I really want to know more about, like, her homework situation. Does mom sit down and do it with you? You know, is it like really explained to you before you go? I mean, as the educator, I've got lots of questions, like, as to why did you pick homework? You know, so in middle school, obviously that's like, no homework. That's like the party day for our kiddos. All right, they're like, it's Friday, it's no homework day, and so that's like their favorite day. So, and then she mentioned the bell. So somebody who didn't make the video clip might have actually said the bell at the end of the day. All right, and so the having that conversation and that thought of, like, why are those students' favorite things what they are, kind of leads us into our learning environment. So a supportive learning environment, whether it's in person or online, really has 6 key components. First, making the learning interactive or creative is a key component to a supportive learning environment. And so if you think about the little girl who talked about how play was her favorite thing, and the kitchen, right? That's that interactive learning that she's doing, right? The adults being role models. And so that's why I think of that little girl who was talking about homework, like, is mom sitting down with her? Or, you know, like, what is her homework situation? Is it just like, it's been really laid out and clearly explained? So why is it that she loves her homework part? And adults need to model self-care to students. And this is really important online, because sometimes we get so ingrained in, like, we've got to get all this stuff done. But sometimes you might be just like explaining to kids as they're looking, he's like, wow, Mrs. Now is really tired today. Like, how many of you guys are just like the Zoom thing or the Google Meets? Like, woo, this is a lot. You know, this is my last class, and being real with students and modeling that self-care of, like, I needed to go take a brain break, and kind of modeling that out loud for students. Because remember, they see you during that synchronous time online, but they don't see what you're doing asynchronously. Right? They think, oh, the teacher, you know, sometimes they think that maybe you're on another class, and you might be. Sometimes they might think you're eating lunch, and maybe it's lunchtime, or maybe you're skipping lunch because you want to try to, like, read some and give some feedback to some students. So, you know, modeling that self-care, because they're only seeing you during that synchronous time, and articulating maybe some of the things you did, like, you know what, I really needed a break, so I took 5 laps around my house right now, you know, kind of modeling that for students. And also doing that within your lessons. Helping kids identify their strengths and weaknesses. And online, that's sometimes really hard for students. Kids who think they're techie think that school online is going to be great. Those middle school boys who will stay up all night playing games will then realize that they think online school is going to be awesome, and it's very frustrating, because that's a different kind of strength, right? It's a different skill. So helping them identify their strengths and weaknesses online and appreciating that. fostering an environment supportive of all students. And this is why that knowing what we're doing during synchronous time is really important, because if we're doing really hard, heavy learning in that synchronous time and we're only offering it one time a day, then those students who are either having internet problems or like I know in the county where I've been working, high school started kind of a week after everybody else, and all of the elementary principals were sharing with me that we thought we had all our tech issues solved, and then all of a sudden the high school is online, which is awesome, but now we've got more internet problems, we've got more connection issues, because now there's more bandwidth issues in the home because those devices weren't online last week, right? So they thought things were solved and they're not. So fostering this environment that's supportive of all students, and also not assuming that that high school kid is going to be free to help solve those tech issues for the littles, because now they're also online. And then understanding that even in an online environment, students need a voice. So if you notice, one of the things that I did today to start was I asked some questions, tried to get to know the room. And normally in a smaller environment with less people in a Zoom, that might be done verbally, but here we did it in the chat. And I actually like both ways for different reasons, because in that chat, people can go back. Like when I need a brain break and I'm listening to this, Adrian now talk to me about this, and I want to, maybe I'm going to scroll through here and go, hey, there's an Avid person in here and I'm kind of getting into Avid. So like that might be someone I want to connect to, right? So using the chat as a brain break as well and giving student that voice. So here's some virtual classroom management tips. And you're going to see that some of them are fairly specific to a virtual classroom. But honestly, these are things that we might be doing in our own classroom. So the first thing you want to consider in a virtual classroom is you want to set your rules and expectations ahead of time. And depending on how that is, so for example, like you might want to explain like, hey, I am expecting if you're not logged in like in the first like 10 minutes, and if you're having internet issues and are really struggling, my expectation might be that you shoot me an email so that I am aware like you're trying to get in, and so that I can kind of watch that waiting room for you, right? So setting those rules and expectations ahead of time. Number two, again, establishing that routine. Yesterday, I ran into a friend of mine. She teaches kindergarten, and I was like, oh, kindergarten on iPads. Like, wow, how is that going? And she was talking about, you know what? I might have changed the song every day of the week when I was in the classroom. I'm not doing that right now. That one song, that song's coming every single day. That's a routine. So they know when they hear that song, our day is starting, you know, and that's something that she's chosen to establish as a routine. So in sticking to that routine. Dealing with discipline issues in the virtual classroom immediately and without exceptions. And again, how you deal with those is going to be set up by those expectations that you've established ahead of time. But sometimes, for example, if I'm seeing someone in the chat not necessarily behaving appropriately, I might have to deal with those immediately, because what happens in a virtual environment is kids feel a little sterilized and a little safe because they're in their home. And so sometimes it can snowball. But dealing with it in a positive and meaningful manner. Include everyone, encourage questions. That's why that synchronous time and what you're doing during that synchronous time is really important, because you want to make sure that you're trying to include everyone. So again, I didn't like call people out who didn't put their information in the chat, but I definitely invited everyone. And if you didn't answer all of the questions, again, I'm not going to call you out. This is the chat, you know, including everyone, encouraging participation, being friendly but firm. That goes back to that confidence. So again, I've had some of my younger students, and when I mean students, they're student teachers and things, who are very used to Zooming with their friends or Google Meeting with their friends, and kind of explaining that, okay, but these are students, right? You can be friendly, but finding what that fine line is, but being firm. And firm is one thing, but I like consistent. Praising the students is really important in an online environment, and being confident and positive. And we're going to kind of go over the praising your students. That's actually going to find a role in the social emotional learning component that we're going to discuss a little later. And again, being confident, positive, that confidence does come across, because remember, and that's one of the things I like about the platforms we have, is that you can see yourself. And remember, I do check in with myself. It's uncomfortable. It's not my favorite thing to do. I'm not that kind of person who's like checking in out every mirror when I walk by. That's not my personality. But one of the things you want to make sure is like keep checking in on yourself. Do I look confident? Do I look positive? And kind of helping to self-monitor you. So sometimes I want to have this conversation in the chat. So when you're establishing procedures, a lot of times teachers think about establishing procedures for the student, but we also need to think about as the teacher, like what are my procedures? So for example, when I was working with students in a Google Classroom in an asynchronous and synchronous environment, I would tell the students that my procedure is I will open the room, I will be in the room 5 minutes before it starts. And that was really clear to communicate with students, because if students showed up early and I didn't let them in right away, some of them would just leave and not come back. Right? Others would be like, you know, they're, hey, where were you? What was going on? It's like, no, I'm in the room. I will open the room 5 minutes early, right? Whatever that procedure is, that's my procedure, but I do share it with the students, because just like I said, they're not with you in that asynchronous time. So they don't know what's going on, and that's not always necessarily something you do need to share with them, but you want to make sure they understand what are you doing in this environment and what are they doing in this environment. So establishing procedures for both the teacher and the student is really important. Depending on the age of the student that you're working with, going back to that concept of student voice, I do like to involve students in this if that's age appropriate. Believe it or not, sometimes the students come up with way tougher procedures for themselves than I would think of. But it's a collective agreement, it's consensus, and they're kind of okay with that. Other times it's like, okay, and sometimes we'll have that discussion. So what is a reasonable time? How early do you need that room open? You know, and then even though in your head you might have that little happy 5 minute mark, and some are like, oh, I want it 10 minutes, or I want it 15 minutes, or some are like, you know, 2 minutes, and you can have that conversation of, well, what would happen in those 10 minutes, and why would that be important? There have been times I've had some of the older students make really reasonable arguments for things that they were looking for, and it was like, you know what, if I could work that into my schedule, maybe it is something that I could do for you, right? So establishing them in that conversation as well, especially the students who have a lot of experience in school. Like I mentioned, my friend is just starting kindergarten. And so especially this first week, there's a lot of what I call partners sitting next to them, learning partners, whether it's a parent, whether it's an older sibling, whether it's an aunt. They've got someone who can kind of help navigate things until the student is comfortable with it and confident. That's not the case in every home, but there's a few of them available. And so that might also be establishing the procedures for the learning partner in the home. Right? Because when I would run into a lot of parents trying to help students to get it done quickly, sometimes they don't do too much. So establishing some procedures also for the learning partners in the home may also be effective in distance learning, okay? And having those conversations with those adults. So here's some different behavior expectations and procedures that you might want to consider. So if you're in asynchronous instruction, expectations, things like, what does participation look like? And these are probably conversations your teams, if you're a teacher, that your grade level team or your site team or your district team has had to determine, you know, for attendance especially. But within participation, what does that look like? You know, is it a percentage of the offline work? Is the offline work weighted heavier than the online work just because of possible internet connection issues? And whatever those expectations are, you want to make sure that they're consistent. Again, that leads us into grades, and the participation is usually a component for grades. And then making sure that the students not only understand that grades might be weighted, but understanding what that weightedness means. I know at the middle school level, when we started weighting grades in terms of what was weighted heavier than others, students didn't quite wrap their brains around what that meant. And they're like, but I did all my classwork. And it's like, yeah, but you know, this assignment was weighted heavier, and trying to get them to understand that. Appropriate use of the stream if you're in Google Classroom. Again, some people like to open that up. I am one of them, because I think it's an opportunity for expectations and procedures. I think it's also a great place for us to teach them a way to use things like social media for professional or learning environment. I have my Twitter account is completely 100% for my professional stuff. My Facebook kind of fuzzes the line a little bit, because I have some friends that I met professionally, so I share some professional resources, but that's also where my family and stuff goes. So it just depends on, and so the stream is definitely a learning environment. And so teaching students the difference between that and say something like their Facebook account or their Instagram. Also, in asynchronous instruction, understanding that they need expectations of what peer review looks like, not just how to review peer, maybe how often you want it, and how to submit it. to peers and how to get credit for it, depending on the platform you're using. Especially we talk about peer review in the classroom and reading each other's inappropriate responses, but then also maybe even setting time limits, like, you know, doing a peer review at 11 o'clock at night might not be the most appropriate thing if you want it to lead to a conversation. During synchronous instruction, again, appropriate dress and location in the home. If they are unable to use virtual backgrounds, that's extremely important. Knowing that, you know, the wall behind them and things like that, appropriate use of chat, when and how to use the camera and microphone, and then of course, just the tools of the platform like we did today. So these are all establishing expectations and procedures, just like you would do in your classroom, but you're gonna need to also separate asynchronous and synchronous time and making sure that they understand those. So again, just like in the classroom, you would teach and practice behavior, expectations for distance learning. So again, if you have the opportunity to involve the students in creating those expectations and consequences for infractions, if it's appropriate, again, age appropriate, or behaviorally appropriate, but then they have some ownership and some voice, and that starts to build that community. And by building that ownership and building that community, they will start to self-monitor. I've had students who might put something in the chat that's questionable, not completely inappropriate, but probably dancing around that line of the expectations we've established as a community. And sometimes, again, just like today, Jessica's and Chelsea are monitoring the chat, and I'm not. Sometimes you get really into your lesson, and there have been times when I've pulled up the chat and I'm like, ooh, and then I read like the next comment and it's like, you know, I know why you said that, but that doesn't really follow our classroom expectations or our classroom procedures. And sometimes students, as they get older, will start to kind of help monitor those things as well. Providing those opportunities to practice the behavior. I have students practice turning on and off their camera, turning on and off their microphone, because especially some of them don't understand that sometimes the microphones will provide feedback. Or if there's another person next to them, that we can hear them on the distance learning, and so they don't quite understand how to time that. And so practicing those things in a distance learning environment is really good, especially when you can give them feedback, or other students will. Sometimes other students, if there is that feedback, someone's like, you know, someone's mic is on, I can hear, you know, someone who's in high school talking about math, and then everybody's like, ooh, that's my sister, right? And they kind of turn it off. So kind of it helps as well. And please plan some time to reteach and review these expectations and procedures. You know, these students are, you know, they're just like we do, especially when they switch from, you know, Zoom, they're on, they're off, they're asynchronous, they're synchronous. And it's going to take a little longer for some of these students to build these into their repertoire and their normal routines. So again, to ensure that this, please, where is it? You want to make sure that the expectations model equity and inclusion. So that's why that if you can involve them in creating it, but let's say you've got 5 kids who had internet problems and couldn't get on, then maybe the next class, when maybe those students are back on, then you bring those norms back up, partly to review and reteach, but also partly to get those students input, like, hey, I know some of you weren't here last time. These are what we talked about as kind of the way we'd run our classroom community. You know, is everyone on board? Are there any questions? Now that and then it also gives those students who might have been just kind of digesting at the time another chance for a voice as well. So bringing those back up and involving them in the conversation may not be a bad idea as well. Now, a lot of what we talk about in the digital community has to do with digital citizenship. So this is Richard Collada, who is the CEO of ISTE. And if you haven't had a chance, ISTE, that's the International Society for Technology and Education. It is a nonprofit. These are kind of like the gurus who have been talking about using technology in education when this concept of technology and education came out. It's a great community. And he talks in here in this video about making citizenship about what to do. And he makes a couple of good points. I'm not going to play the whole video, but I am going to let him begin.
Far too often, digital citizenship is taught in a negative way. Here's the list of things not to do online. And while I deeply appreciate the intent behind all the anti-cyberbullying campaigns, we don't teach other things as anti in our schools, right? I mean, we don't have like an anti-illiteracy campaign. We teach people to love to read. Digital citizenship shouldn't be a list of don'ts, but a list of do's. La Cañada School District in California decided instead of teaching anti-cyberbullying, They were going to start teaching their kids what it meant to be good cyber friends, which includes watching out for people who aren't being treated respectfully online. In addition to being more compelling, by the way, keeping it positive is actually something you can practice. You can't practice not doing something. The other thing we need to evolve is our thinking around recognizing that the skills required to thrive as a digital citizen go far beyond just online safety. It includes being respectful of people with differing viewpoints from our own, recognizing fact from fiction online, using technology to engage in civil action, knowing how to have the right balance of activities online and offline, and of course, knowing how to be safe and also create safe spaces for others. These aren't skills that students are learning, by the way, by watching adults either, you may have noticed. So we also have to do a better job ourselves. Last year in Chicago, we challenged you to commit to doing at least one thing differently to teach digital citizenship in a
Oops. Of course I did that. So when he talks about this commit is actually an organization.
In her words,
Oops.
no more.
Sorry.
We challenged you to commit to doing at least one thing differently to teach digital citizenship in a positive, broader way. And we asked you to share your stories. We got so many stories. I wish I could take the time to share all of them with you, but let me just give one or two quick examples. Laura Carey, a 5th grade teacher in California, committed to modeling good digital citizenship by citing all of the sources that she used. In her words, no more snatching an image just because it's for my class. Or a technology integration specialist from Elk Grove USD who committed to supporting students in, again, in their words, using technology as a global microphone to connect communities beyond their classrooms. Unfortunately, the people who most need to hear this message aren't sitting in this room today. So we are planning a bold next step, and we need your help. ISTE, in partnership with like-minded organizations, is launching an international campaign around redefining digital citizenship. We're calling, yes, you can clap for that, thank you. We're calling on students, educators, parents, and community members to take action in ensuring that our students have the skills they need to be effective digital citizens. We will be curating the best resources we can find to help teachers and parents talk to their kids about these important skills, and we'll be sharing them at digcitcommit.org. With your help, we have a shot at creating a radically better future.
And so those resources, and that's actually why I did let it go, because that's one of the resources at the end. So if the students have good digital citizenship, then that also helps the classroom community and building an online community. And remember, I talked about how they could self-monitor the chat and things like that. That all comes from those digital citizenship expectations. So when you incorporate some of those things within your classroom and within your classroom community, and so I've gone through some of those resources. I shared them sometimes with students. I said, is there anything here that might help us? Like when students are like, I don't know what we should do in class. I don't know what the procedure should be. I don't know what our expectations should be. Then I pull up some of those resources as a guide. Say, is there anything here that speaks to us that kind of feels like us? And that's one thing I always, because kids are all about them. I have a 4-year-old. I taught middle school for 16 years. I work with the college students at UC Merced. I have yet to run into anybody who doesn't always think first about like, how does this affect me? Is this me? Does it fit my situation? And so that's what you're going to want to do when you're building this classroom community, is find these things that are going to fit the environment and the classroom and the culture that you're building in your classroom. So these are some examples of some behavior expectations. I did steal them from Merced City, but they were over here. We've got some kind of, what does it look like in TK1 and digital citizenship? So how should I act when I'm learning online? And so they kind of picked 4 keys, like be respectful, patient, be prepared, and be engaged. That actually transfers. It doesn't matter if you're the TK1 grade level band, if you're 2-6, if you're middle school, those 4 things kind of remain the same. And then maybe the language of what that looks like might be a little different. But to be totally honest, I actually use these TK1s even in my adult when I'm dealing with someone, because I would love it if they would have clean hands when they're handling whatever device. Middle schoolers too, like, hey guys, hot Cheeto fingers. not great on the Chromebooks, right? So having that conversation, clean hands sounds like a TK1. It's actually a middle school thing. No food or water. Okay, at the middle school level, we said, hey, no corner store soda next to the device, please. You know, that doesn't help us out very much. Okay, and when you sign in, what name do you use depending on what device you're using? The norms on the right, those are norms for teachers using live video with students, but now I actually use these with students as well, because students don't always think about this. Selecting this good location in your home to do video with students, okay? And thinking about what's behind them. I had the same kindergarten teacher was sharing that she had a young man who mom came out of the restroom from the shower to go get dressed and wasn't 100% dressed appropriate, didn't think about knew her son was going to school, knew that he was online, didn't really think about what was behind. So there was a nice little message to mom like, hey, could you make sure that this young man has a wall behind him when you set him up? Just so you know, this is kind of what happened. And so it was like, oh, I'm so sorry. You're right. I didn't even think about that. And she was, of course, totally embarrassed. And so we want to try to prevent that. And so as they get older, some of this gets left of choosing your spot to the students. I was meeting with a young man online who's an intern the other day. And I was like, hey, next time we meet, could it not be leaning against like the wall in your bedroom? And I said, I know that that's probably a very quiet place in your house. And I totally understand that that's probably why you chose that. But remember, this is still a professional meeting and we're having a learning conversation. So sometimes it's just even with adults having those conversations. Testing the volume and speaker and this is for teachers, you know, not recording the meeting, we're recording this. As we're all adults, but noticed it did ask you and tell you ahead of time that was happening. So these are all best practices for teachers using live video with students. It was actually taken from a website where she actually used the students to do some screencasting as well. And so that was actually just best practices for students. So these are additional distance learning norms. Like I said, if you notice the grade level just by grade band, it just sort of changes the language, gets a little deeper into what those expectations are. Again, I did borrow this, the teacher librarians at Merced City. If you think about it, the teacher librarian credential actually has a giant digital citizenship component. And so that was why they were tasked with creating the norms that could be used district-wide, but by grade band so that the language was age appropriate. And so that is where I gratefully was allowed to use these. But again, that appropriate language for those behavior expectations. And so if we were to write some expectations, again, we want to remember to use positive language. We would want to also choose the situation. So that's why it says for blank, right? So when I'm going to do this with students, I would like to say, hey, let's write some behavior expectations for our morning routine, okay? Or for using Zoom. You know, and you want to make sure that it's fairly specific. And then here's some just ideas for topics: respect for self, for others, environment, or for learning. You may have an acronym. For example, I know that if you are a PBIS school, you might be PAWS, you might be SOAR, you might be showing being a bear, right? You've got all these different acronyms and what that stands for. Taking that component, what you used on site, and using it for your expectations will also make the transition back to school easier when we go face-to-face. So if you already have some systems set up school-wide for PBIS, then trying to use that acronym and what as well will help those students make the connection to school. It's also a way to introduce that acronym. So if you have a new student to your school, maybe the rest of your students are familiar with the acronym, know what it stands for, but those new students may not. So just like you would teach it at the beginning of the year, the difference is now we're going to use that as our frame to help collectively write some behavior expectations. The next thing you want to think about is how you might teach those expectations in an online environment. So remember, so you might want to practice. You can have students, for example, one of the big ones, if you're going to let students screen share, to be collaborative and to lead Socratic circles and to show what's on their screen, that might be something you practice. Because taking turns, how do you figure out whose screen is sharing when, right? Is it someone you call on? Is it by volunteer? Is it, they raise their hand? Like, what is the procedure that you've developed to choose who's going to share with their screen when? And again, then the screen share might become the talking stick. So I know the lower elementary school students, they like the talking stick because if you're holding the stick, you get to do the talking. Well, if your screen is up, you get to share, right? So what are those procedures that you're establishing? And then how are you going to teach those and practice them? So here's some little tips and tricks when you're in an online environment. Students still need some kind of designated time to socialize. So that's the other reason that I use the chat in here, because it could be such a large group that this way is sort of a way to make connections and to slightly socialize. But in a classroom, you know, maybe that's why that student is like, hey, can you get on 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes before class? And maybe like the 9 o'clock hour that you're supposed to start teaching, that's yours. But can we maybe have 5 minutes to check in? Whenever I was running different trainings for the district I was in, I would always be like, all right, guys, this is your time. And it'd be like, oh, hey, how's it going? I saw your Facebook picture. Your daughter's beautiful, or whatever. You know, even adults need that time to make that connection. But so do students. Remember, that's the part that's kind of really hard for them. They're in their homes and they're not having a chance to build that community. Using the mute features, waiting rooms, breakout rooms, when available. We're going to talk about procedures for breakout rooms. Remember, my personal feeling on breakout rooms, I don't like to put students in breakout rooms unless there's an adult to be in there with them. Just like sending kids to another classroom isn't always a good idea unless there's somebody there to be with them. But there are some strategies, especially if you have older students that you need those breakout rooms for. This is a strategy I like to use with my university students, and that is I'll create a slide deck with the question that they're supposed to be working on in those breakout rooms, because that's what they're for. It's collaborative environment. And so it'll be the same slide deck, but the number of their breakout room, that's the slide they use. And then I will have the slide deck open and I will monitor those slides. And if I see one that's kind of not right on topic, that might be the room I go into to kind of redirect. Or if there's another one where a lot of stuff's not being written on, but everybody else is kind of getting to the point where they're being done, that might be the room. Maybe they need some extra guidance or they need some clarification on the ask, right? So that Google slide deck kind of becomes my place to monitor the work in the breakout room. I also let them know that. Especially if they're kind of my freshman students in college, I'll be like, hey, by the way, this is why these slides are here. Please make sure to use them. Even if they're notes, you can erase what you're writing. I'm seeing it live, remember. But this way, it helps me monitor and helps me guide you. And so that's one way to do breakout rooms to manage the behavior. Communicate these expectations with parents. Especially in a K-12 environment. Like I said, that they had that learning partner sitting with the kinders for the first week of school, just because if they were available. I mean, it wasn't mandatory. A lot of parents were working, but if they could have one, it was really helpful. And they would communicate that with the parents as well. And then that also opens that two-way communication back with you from the parents, depending on what you have, whether it's Parent Square, whether there's you through your Aries application, through your learning management system, if you've got a way to communicate with the parents, making sure to often communicate what's going on in the breakout rooms, in your classroom, and the expectations and community you're developing. Document the redirections to demonstrate a pattern. So this is something in our classrooms we started to get really good at. If we needed to redirect a student multiple times, especially for your PBIS and you're looking at behavioral interventions that may be necessary, you maybe get really good at documenting what that looks like. But when we get into an online environment, we might be there may be one more thing we're trying to think about, but the more that you document those redirections and demonstrate a pattern and the attempts to reinforce the appropriate behavior, when you do communicate with the parents or with your administration, you've got some documentation. If you can try to start incorporating some like inquiry and project-based learning, full of positives with that inquiry and positive, the project-based learning, for example, that can start to guide your asynchronous time and your synchronous time. So your synchronous time becomes this opportunity to discuss the inquiry and the learning that's happening offline. Then when they come back to line, now it's more of a Socratic dialogue or a facilitated conversation about what everyone's working on. And it's also going to be engaging, and also that offline, that asynchronous assignments are more likely to be completed and being worked on because they know that that's going to be the subject of the conversation when they come back online. The other thing is, please make sure you know the components of the teacher and student acceptable use contract for your district. Okay, so I did mention breakout rooms, but some districts have been very clear where, you know, if there's not where it's not just like it's not best practice to have kids in a breakout room, but actually might be written into the AUC. There was a lot of revisions made this year for the teacher and for the student. For example, some of the districts have added to the student one, when parents sign it, that the district is acting as a proxy for some of these programs, because we're running into a lot of these programs that record students need a permission slip, or in some of them, a lot of them are written in that the district can be the proxy, okay, which is why that's now written into some of the AUCs. So for example, Flipgrid. Flipgrid is awesome. I love it. Kids love it. They like to see each other. They like to see the videos of each other. But Flipgrid says that either the district can act as a proxy for permission, or they need a permission slip under, I can't remember if it's 16 or 13, because it depends on the program. And so understanding what's in the acceptable use contract before you start to do things like Flipgrid. So we talked a little bit about social emotional learning of students. There's a few components I want to talk about. First is being aware of what the core SEL competencies are. So when you're talking about social emotional learning, there are 5 core competencies, right? And so this is self-awareness, self-management, and so those are very different. Just because a student knows their behavior is incorrect doesn't mean that they're managing it appropriately, right? Self-management, and this can also be for the classroom community. Responsible decision-making, the relationship skills, and that's social awareness. So all of those are components that when your classroom community starts to form, if a lot of your conversations have to do with those 5 competencies, it helps build the community. Here's an example. We talked about students who start to self-monitor the chat as a class, right? So maybe the one may do something that's kind of on the edge of the expectations. Another student decides that they're going to help monitor the class behavior. Okay, well now if we get down to these relationship skills and social awareness, sometimes they do it in an appropriate manner and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they might say, hey, Chelsea, I know that you wrote this in the chat, might not have been about following what we're doing here in class, right? Is there a different way you could communicate that, right? That would be being socially aware and working on relationship skills. But someone else who's just trying to help monitor the chat might say, hey, you Nimrod, you shouldn't have written on the chat. You're going to get us all in trouble, right? That again is not building those relationship skills, and it's not being socially aware, but they are trying to help with that self-management and responsible decision making. So those 5 competencies kind of work together to build the whole classroom community. Now, what does that look like in lesson design? Well, designing synchronous student interactions, if you're thinking with that SEL hat in mind, there's really a 3-step practice process according to the Castle, which is a nonprofit organization. By the way, that's also one, the handbook for this is also going to be in the resources at the end. And that is you want to start your lesson with some kind of a welcoming inclusion activity, whether it's a routine or ritual. So, and it can be any of those 3 things. So today I tried to do a welcoming and inclusion activity. Hey, use the chat. Let's say hi, let's see who's in the room, right? That was kind of my welcoming inclusion activity. So it was kind of tried to be positive, warm greeting. Sometimes it's your morning circles. Maybe you start your day with some peer homework help. Maybe that's why you open 15 minutes early. The kid's like, hey, can we try to help each other with our homework first? Awesome, that'd be fantastic. Because again, that's supporting the community. That is supporting the social awareness, the awareness, that's everything in those 5 capsules. Go for it. Yeah, I'll open the room 15 minutes early for that. All right, if that's what you're doing, it's not playtime, and again, setting up those expectations. Whole group greetings, like, good morning, boys and girls. I'm so excited to see you. Happy Monday morning. And sometimes that whole group greeting might be a recorded message that you play. So it's like I played some videos today. But that recorded message, the nice thing about that is for those students who miss that opening, right, that welcoming inclusion or that whole group greeting, they're not going to miss out. They can go back asynchronously and look at it. So that's kind of the intro to the SEL lesson in mind. The next one is looking at these engaging strategies, building opportunities in the lesson for interaction, which, like I said, is really hard here, but I had a couple of those slides, where I had you kind of like, oh, in the chat, like what might be some things that you would do? but depending on the environment and how much time you have, you're going to try to get as much possible into those engaging strategies. So one of my favorite in this online environment is Socratic seminars, because, if you start to get into, and the digital gallery walks, those are so much fun. That's that screen sharing, like, okay, hey, you all just worked on these, and maybe that's asynchronous, those Google slide decks, instead of being in breakout rooms. Maybe you have group work assigned. You're like, hey guys, here's our Google slide deck. When we come back in 30 minutes, let's see how you guys have put this together. And that becomes that digital gallery walk. Okay, everyone who worked on slide 1, let's pull up your slide. You guys can unmute your mics. You guys can explain what happened. All right. Again, giving them that chance to engage into those strategies. It gives them autonomy, belonging, but it also lets them demonstrate competence that they've built within their community. And the very last one, and that's going to be a bulk of your lesson, by the way, is those engaging strategies. And the very last one is an optimistic closure. And that is leaving it with like, gosh, you guys worked so hard today. I can't believe the hour is over. Oh my goodness, this is fantastic. I'm so excited to see you guys tomorrow. And if you didn't finish that slide, go ahead and finish it offline. And maybe, group 5, I know you guys ran into some issues. You explained you had some tech stuff. Maybe you guys could go tomorrow. That'd be awesome, right? Give you guys a chance to kind of have some time tomorrow, right? And that's that optimistic closure that's going to support the students' social emotional learning. So there are some hidden benefits to this online classroom. So we get to model every day this real world application of internet safety, right? Talking about student safe searches. That's a big hit for me. Students think google.com is safe. It's not. Right? Perfect example, when I was running the STEAM Center, and we would give them, for the hands-on performance task, they would get some kind of a mystery powder found in the home. It was usually things like salt, sugar, flour, super, super safe kitchen science, but they would have to run some tests and determine what it was. So they would do some research on properties. And sometimes if they went to google.com and typed in properties, because we had a crime scene story of like, hey, somebody stole my waffle this morning, and we want to know who stole this waffle. So they would have some like story that goes with it. So they go like, white powder found at a crime scene. You can only imagine what comes back on google.com. It's usually not flour, just saying. So that being the case, that real world application of internet safety, and here's some student safe searches and putting those things together. Modeling that appropriate behavior for that online learning environment. So for example, when you're talking about, hey, make sure there's a wall behind you or virtual background, you can say like, look, I've decorated, look at, do you guys like this? It says, home is love, or whatever your little happy thing is behind you that's in your house. You're kind of modeling like, yes, this is what I'm expecting. So now go ahead and do it as well. And then that practical application to using these online forums for learning and professional purposes. So we have this chance to model for students where when they end up in these online forums that are for professional learning and they're for purposes of creating an increased knowledge, some people have a problem straying from the way they act personally on their social media versus professionally. So we do have that opportunity. So the next question is, how do we restore students to good standing? Because if we've had to have some conversations with students, we've had to document some behavior, what are some resources that we could use to support students in that online behavior? Well, Common Sense Education has some great, especially K-8, K-6 especially, but some K-8 lessons that go with that. There's also here these 9 resources for teaching digital citizenship. There's also some that go up through the high school, and that's where this DigCit commit comes in from ISTE. So ISTE has partnered with Google, they've partnered with Facebook. I mean, you saw that list of companies. And that, by the way, that company list is growing. That's a little bit of an older webinar that they put out there. If they were to do that slide today, there's an even bigger list. And so companies are realizing, especially as students are spending more and more time online with distance learning, that there's a real need for digital citizenship online. And so they're partnering with ISTE. That's kind of the hub for them all to kind of share their resources. So again, what are some virtual ways to build this community online? Reach out, check in with students and parents, and first and foremost, reach out to the families and check in with them. Kind of make these assumption of positive intentions. If a student is consistently not showing up to class, don't just assume that he's decided not to come to class. There may be some legitimate reasons. Maybe the classes that time of day happens to be when people are leaving for work and things are getting set up, and we got to, you know, make sure that the littles have food. So reach out, check in with those students, and first and make sure that they're on board with what's going on. If you can, host social gatherings for students to interact with each other. So maybe it's this little time in the beginning of class. Maybe that's your Fun Friday activity of like, hey, you know what, guys, we're going to do this, you know, we're going to have lunch together on Friday if you want, right? It can be super casual. I'll be in the room. I'll open the room. We can come on in. That's our chance to, you know, have lunch with our friends, talk about our day. What are we going to do this weekend? And then this way they're engaged for those social interactions. Arranging virtual spirit weeks. This gets really creative because it may not be just the dress up days and the activities, but it might be, you know, for example, today is the red day in kindergarten. So when we come back at the end of the day, you need to have something on your table that's red, right? Or something on your table that's blue, right? And start to, you know, bring those things in that students can share. And include those parents in the learning and those teaching experiences if possible. Invite them, all right? It doesn't mean it's a mandatory inclusion, but make sure that they know that they're invited, because that's an awkward situation for the adults in the house, right? Everyone's online, everyone's learning. Like, am I supposed to like help you? Am I not supposed to be here? What's my role? And being really clear with the adults in the house. Include opportunities for that asynchronous participation. Again, don't assume that just because the students aren't there, that things aren't working out very well for them on their, you know, that things are going poorly and they're just not interested in school. There may be some connection issues, or it may be that that's the same time that the first grader needs to get on and the first grader is not competent with the iPad, and that older student ends up helping with that. And then providing those opportunities to connect online learning to the student's environment. Any chance you can tie the what's going on synchronously to asynchronous, whether it's, you know, for example, I'm, you know, focus on science mostly. So if we're talking about nature journaling and students maybe don't have anything, well, you know what, go get a vegetable out of your drawer. Nature journal that. Is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? You know, the big discussions, tomatoes and bell peppers and peppers, jalapeno, is that a fruit or a vegetable? Come back, make your argument. Let's see if we can decide as a class, is it a fruit or vegetable, you know, and start to pull into some of those offline learning experiences to connect to the online learning environment for the home environment. So here's some different platforms that we use to support this distance learning. Google Classroom. Google Classroom can be asynchronous, but now the Meet control is right in there. So if you pair it with Google Meet, it could be synchronous or asynchronous. Google Classroom just by itself is great for peer review. The stream allows for some interaction that the teacher can monitor. Throwing out daily questions or polls also on Google Classroom will help build that community. The daily question or poll may be related to the learning, or it may be just a component to build the community. So yesterday we tried out this procedure for sharing the screen. I have my thoughts. What are yours? And maybe the student's like, oh, it was really clunky. I didn't know when I could share mine. And you might find out from the student perspective some things that are going on. Jamboard, if you haven't used Jamboard much, that's in the Google Suite as well. Jamboard is great as an interactive whiteboard that students can share. They've got stickies, they can add images. And so Jamboard is a lot of fun for students to use as well. And it also helps build community because they can add to each other's. Nearpod. Nearpod has the collaborate boards. So that's that piece of Nearpod, the collaborate boards, is really good for building community because it's a place where they can respond and then respond to each other. And then of course, Zoom and Google Meet. So these are all features, of course, that are coming in the next couple of months on Google Meet as well. So if your district has gone to Google Meet and left the Zoom platform, but you maybe miss your background, your virtual background, those things are being embedded into the Google Meet as well. And those things are coming in the next couple of months. So then we've got this list of teacher supports to help you with your students. Google Teach from Home, it's got sections for educators, students, and parents. It's a great resource if you haven't looked at that. To pair with that, over here on this side, I have EDU and 90. It was a YouTube channel for teacher support videos from Google. They are about 90 seconds to 2 minutes long, and that's it. So they're super short. Sometimes they're just updates of what's coming, and sometimes they're targeted to specific issues that they've had questions from for teachers. Future Ready Schools is a great nonprofit organization who helps put some things out. Hashtag I Can Help is also an organization that's working on deleting negativity in social media, but a lot of their resources can be converted to the online environment. ISTU, DigitCommit. So the SEL3 signature playbook, this is linked here. This is the PDF for the full playbook where they've actually got like the procedure for Socratic seminars, procedures for digital gallery walks, and the Castle SEL competency wheel and definitions, that was that on that same page as well. So this is for the social emotional learning component. That was the resources for the slide that I created there as well. So that being said, I would like to, before we end and I take questions, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch Man on the Street. I really do like this series. But he goes to the street and just asks random people a question. And this was the question he asked. What was your favorite teacher? Come on.
I mean, you gotta just start talking. All right.
I have had a lot of great teachers in my life. There's one teacher that stands out in my mind, and her name was Miss Pills.
10th grade literature, Mr. Cremian.
It's my mom.
My parents are the ones who really helped educate me growing up.
I had the same teacher for 4th and 5th grade, and his name was Rexford Wells Bowling Jr., Mr. Crespo, Mr. Shanker.
Ira Abrams, but we just called him Papa in class.
Mr. Bill Yee, really good man. We clashed on one thing. He's a Giants fan, I'm a Dodgers fan, so.
He let me be way too silly and didn't really curb that, but he kind of let me explore that. I love to draw, and she let me do projects that included drawing in my book reports.
I mean, I guess I kind of was like class clown, goof off, and I guess he figured it out that I was just bored in class. So what he actually would start doing was let me pick and choose my own assignments.
She was just always like very supportive, and at times when I did not trust myself, she just was always there like lifting me up.
This teacher was instrumental in my own development as a teacher, and I was wise enough actually to marry her 41 years ago, and she continues to be an inspiration to myself and my children and 40 years worth of students in her own life.
What makes someone a really good teacher is, first of all, they have to be personable. Someone who is imaginative and just like has a deep heart.
It's really important that they care, because otherwise I think you just kind of become numbers in a classroom.
You can't fake it as a teacher because the students will pick up on that. You really do have to love the kids that you're working with.
Well, I personally think education is very important. Give us an opportunity to learn so we can enrich our livelihoods.
It's a way where we could learn not only to live our life the right way, but also to make the world a better place.
Education in that sense is another form of love.
Thank you, Papa I, for the best education.
Thank you, Carol, for everything you've done for me.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Bowling.
Thanks, Mr. Cremian.
Thank you, Mr. Crespo. Thank you, Dr. Gussich. And all the other wonderful teachers that I've had in my lifetime. And I thank you so much.
So just as a reminder, remember that when we're talking classroom community, an integral member of that classroom community is you. You set the tone. And my favorite is that when he talked about being the love, but also confident, like all of them, you know, there's no way that guy who talked about being silly, there's no way he could be silly without a teacher who could also tell him when silly was done. So, you know, just this is why creating a classroom environment that's a community of learners is extremely important for student success. So I'm going to stop sharing. I will take questions. I will, if you have, if you want to ask each other questions, sometimes that's always helpful too. We have some mentor teachers in here. We have some experienced teachers, some newer teachers to the profession. But my role is now just to facilitate you guys because I've given you a lot of information. Okay. Well, I know that Jessica has a survey that she can put into the chat. How do you tackle a situation where one student is bullying another in a chat? Excellent question. So the temptation is to shut it down. But so is there another way? So there's a couple of options when that's happening. So because I've actually worked with some new teachers who had this exact situation occur. So the chat, first of all, there are ways that you can shut down the chat, but the problem is when you shut it down for one, you're probably going to be shutting it down for all the students in your class. So again, making sure that you've established the expectation is extremely clear, and how we treat each other and all that. But the other thing is you can actually, if you need to, and this is always not my favorite resort, you can put students into the waiting room. Especially in Zoom, that feature is coming in Google Meet, where you can actually, because you don't want to remove them from the class because they can pop back in. Sometimes it might be putting them in a waiting room, but one of my favorite things is actually to use breakout rooms. And again, I'm not a fan of putting students in there unsupervised, but that way they're not out of the chat and they can't just jump back in. But I have used the breakout rooms to put students in so that we can have that private conversation about how we treat each other. And again, if I've had to do that, I will document the incident. And the other thing I remind students on that is you can record chat. And so if you look right now, there's 3 little dots that says save chat. Sometimes students don't realize you can save chat depending on how old they are. And sometimes that, once they find that out, is a deterrent enough. And a lot of times I will save the chat for a lot of my interactions for a couple of reasons, one of which is for those students who might have missed some of the conversation, right? You're not recording the students, but you're saving the chat, which is a little different. It's not their phases, it's not their homes. It is okay to save the chat in most of those acceptable use contracts. I always run it by my principal first, but I would save the chat. And the other thing is, once you save the chat and then you have that conversation with the student, you know, depending on the type of student they are and previous interactions, if it's the first offense, that might be, hey, just so you understand, I have saved the chat. I am going to kind of write a little note that I'm talking to you. I might even need, depending on what the bullying is, if it's severe enough, it may be something that requires more interaction. If it's just kind of getting started and it's something I think that I might be able to nip in the bud, then I might say, hey, you know what? I've got everything. I've got all this documentation. That this is considered, you know, this is our first offense. Second offense, this is when I start to share this information, like what you said in the chat, with principals or with parents or with someone in charge, just like you would in a classroom. The difference is, so if you have to use the breakout room, you can, but sometimes I don't like to put them in there, you know, by themselves. It's not the best practice. But that is a place you can have that personal conversation. I've had it where I've asked students and I've kind of texted moms and said, or whoever's in charge, and said, hey, we had a little incident today. I would love to chat with you about it. Can you and your child join me in a meeting? And I might even include another adult or representative of the school, and then say, hey, just FYI, this is kind of the step we had. This is, I've got some documentation of it if you need to see the evidence. This is kind of not how we operate. So, you know, this is just our chance to kind of work through this on our own, just like you would do at home. Let's see, do you have examples of questions or games you can do with the whole class online as a brain break? You know what? Actually, I do, but one of my favorite things, I'll do usually a couple, for example, brain breaks. I like to do, I don't know if you ever do the mindfulness, any of those mindfulness apps. Sometimes I like to play some of those, just kind of like, all right, everybody, like close your eyes. And it's really important they close their eyes because then they're cutting that screen time. Sometimes I'll play a little bit from a mindfulness app. And then it's also not my voice. I've had them try to play some of actually some of the game components of Nearpods. I'll incorporate some of those as well. They really like those. The other thing that I've done is, once I've done a couple of examples of things that are acceptable, I might ask them, like, you know, Simon Says is really fun on Zoom. because you can only, like, you can see like Simon says, stick out your tongue, and you need a monitor. You need a couple of them, like in those, and that's great for those kids who don't really want to like do the funny faces or whatever. And Simon Says on Zoom is really fun. Like Simon Says, turn on your camera, turn it off, and then like the ones that turn off, you're like, oh, right, you're out. And so that's, again, following directions. Let's see, how do you set the tone the first day of class without boring students? Yeah, so I'm not a fan of the rules on the first day, especially for students who were coming back to distance learning. I know that there's some basic things that we need to establish in terms of procedures, but I do like to kind of start the day with, this is your chance. They're back to school. They're excited about being back to school, especially, I mean, they may not have been super thrilled because it was distance learning if they didn't have the greatest experience in the spring. But for the most part, they've been craving human interaction. And so planning out some of those Socratic seminars, not necessarily on, deep topics, but giving a lot of facilitated conversation and, hey, throwing things out there like, hey, what do you think the first thing we should, here's a list of things we're looking at in science. Have you seen anything on the news like this? Or sending them off to do a little bit of research, like, hey, who can find who can be the first one to drop something in the chat about Neowise? Okay, I'm a science person, right? Who can be the first one to guess what? They're researching. It's a race. They're trying to beat someone, right? And then they're learning about the features. They're dropping things in the chat, and that's kind of fun. It's kind of engaging. And then I'll be like, all right, hey, we just had Perseid meteor shower, right? Can anybody like find the difference? Why was there no meteor shower with Neowise? Ready? Go. And like giving them a question, you can have some slides prepared. Now they're out there, they're kind of doing research, you're kind of driving what they're looking for, and like the first one to do, drop it in there, and then someone can keep score on Jamboard or something. Those are kind of fun little interactive things to do on the first day that starts to get them thinking about the topic, starts them to get them build culture. Let's see, particular icebreaker activity to start this semester. You know what, another thing is, I used to always do like student bingo, where I would be like, find someone who has the same number of siblings as you. Find someone who was born in the same town, right? And that student bingo is always fun. But now what I've done is I've done it on Google Slides, right? And so now it's like they'll put like, find someone who has the same number of siblings. And so they might go to that slide and be like, okay, Adrian, and then I might next to it put my answer, has 3, right? And then if someone else has 3, they could put their names there too, right? And so they could kind of use that to kind of just go through the slides, kind of put their own answers. Then they have to go back, and they're now looking for someone who they could match up with, right? And be like, hey, like, Jessica, you and I have the same number of siblings. Like, are they all boys? Are they all girls? Right? And then that's that beginning of icebreaker. Yeah, that one I like because it was pretty easy to convert. And I already kind of had the questions, but instead of it being a bingo card, they just kind of did it in Google Slides. What advice would you give to students to help them upkeep their wellness and mental health during online learning, especially for the younger students? Great question, Julia. So one of the things you have to keep reminding them to do is to get up. And like I say, model good self-care. I'm terrible at this. I work through lunches, like right now, especially with COVID, I work at the county office. We've got offices. I don't have to wear my mask if my door is closed. So I literally go in, keep my door closed, and I'm locked in my office. And that's terrible, right? So again, modeling it yourself and be like, hey guys, all right, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna do 5 laps around my house. And when I come back, I wanna see who can do more than 5. Like, you have to be on the screen before I get back, right? Ready, go. And giving them tasks that take them offline or away from the screen. I know a lot of parents, rightly so, have concerns about screen time. And so any opportunity that you can direct what they're doing away from the screen, but getting them away from the screen, getting them away from that blue light. So that's some really good information as well. All right, so yeah. Jessica's I'm gonna turn it over to Jessica. You want to drop the in the chat?
Yeah, so we would like to ask all the participants to take a couple of minutes to answer this super quick survey. It's going to give us some feedback about today's webinar, but then also see what kind of topics you would like us to cover for future webinars. I do want to say thank you to Adrian and to everyone who joined us tonight. As mentioned, this is only the first of the many webinars we'll have. So after this webinar, sometime tomorrow or Monday, you will get an email that contains all the slides from Adrian's presentation, as well as the link to the survey again, and then also the link to where you can see where we'll be updating for our future webinars. But I'll stick around for a couple of minutes if you have any questions, if you want to chat. But thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I hope to see you in our future webinars.
So Maximus, strategies for teaching a large class. I think it would also depend on the age of the large class. Because if they're older students, most of the time a larger class is going to be older students. If you can incorporate breakout rooms because they're old enough to be able to be like that's acceptable to use breakout rooms, it's a great way to decrease the numbers. So having a lot of small group tasks and then managing with those Google Slides is one really great way to address that. That way they can go out, they can have some autonomy, they're still working on the task, but then when they come back together, because yeah, the large class, that's why, and the chat is extremely important. So if this is a small enough group, I can have conversations, but when we looked at the registered numbers for today, it was going to be almost 90 people, which means I needed to switch a lot of what I did and using that chat. So that chat is also, if I need to keep everyone together, the chat in a large class becomes your friend, because it does give students a chance to have a voice, but it's also something that you can manage and that's something that you can control somewhat. So for example, like right now, participant can chat with no one, the host only. So I could actually turn it off so you couldn't talk to each other and could only talk to me, right? Or that you could only talk to me and everyone. So using that chat as managing a large class, if you can't break them into great breakout rooms, is also another good strategy. So.